this journey?
Sure, so to give a very short version of a very long story, many years ago, Alfred was working on his PhD in philosophy at Roskilde University, simply, in some sense, trying to explore the way that the internet can catalyze new forms of collaboration around big challenges. And as part of that research, he had made a documentary. Will and I, meantime, were living in India and saw a trailer for that documentary. We're fascinated by some of these questions about how the sort of culture and nature of the internet could catalyze new ways of learning and new ways of collaborating around big challenges. And long story short, we started out via email and Skype connecting with Alfred and saying, amazing questions, amazing ideas, if there's anything we can do to help, let us know. And we got a very concrete answer. He said, how about we come to India and ask some of these same questions and make another documentary? And so the journey kind of continued from there, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we sort of dove in with just a bunch of questions about how the growth of the internet in India was going to affect things like education, affect the capacity to collaborate in networked ways around big challenges. And just the last piece of context, when we began the film journey, as you kind of see in the credits, there were almost 1 billion people in India that still didn't have an internet connection, but there were enormous efforts from the government, from Facebook, from Google, from civil society, all across India, across sectors, to really ramp up connectivity as fast as possible. And so in many senses, we saw the film just as a way of kind of, from a grassroots perspective, trying to understand what does this mean, but more importantly, what does this hyper-connectivity mean for education? What does it mean for the way that people can work together to solve many of the challenges sort of on the ground in India, but also globally? And that's kind of how the whole thing evolved. So.
And I would just add to that, and how can we use the film itself as an experiment for how some learning through internet-based means and collaboration using the new 21st century technologies can enable new knowledge to be born, in this case in the form of film. So it's really kind of an experiment in the various topics that we were exploring through the film itself. A bit meta.
So allow me just to ask a kind of obvious question that I think many of us is puzzled about, is that how did it come about that a philosopher of science started doing documentary filmmaking, Alfred?
It's a good question. I think that especially today, we have to look at open science as a very concrete possibility for science. And I think documentary film is one way to engage your audience. And also, like, when you do a documentary film, you are kind of really a part of what you're doing, becoming really close to the world. And especially with the age of the internet, it's taking so many forms. And I explored it in Silicon Valley, the birth of the modern technology. And from there have been this dream 40 years ago. And I think the most of us is now in a broken dream with the internet, you could say. And then I thought that, especially because Daniel and William was taking so much charge of this, that, you know, the first glimpse of the internet is still so interesting, that we have cultures out there that are just right now exploring what it can be. And they have much more this modern understanding that this great technology can do all these great things. And most of us today live in a much more postmodern kind of reality, where we think, yeah, the internet, but this is a tool, but can we do anything? Or is it just a tool that are taking us places where we don't even want to go? So for me, also because Roskilde was supporting that, it's like looking at how different medias can do different things. And documentary film can do definitely something when it comes to science and communication, also being really close to what you are working with.
Sure. So now we're still talking about the journey, and I don't really want to let you off that hook yet. So where is the journey taking you from now on and looking forward? Has the journey ended, or has it just begun for you three guys?
So the journey continues, is the short answer. I think there's a couple of things. One, in the sort of spirit of open learning, our plan is to take, as you can see in the credits, there's probably 30, 40 people that we met with and shared their stories and shared their perspectives. And so as a baseline, our plan is to, over the coming months, release all of the material that we captured along the way in sort of a curated fashion, in sort of open ways, so people can use it in classrooms, can use it however they want to continue navigating all of the learning and insights that we captured along the way. That's sort of one piece, but the other piece is that one of the other stories from the film that emerged around an open source pharmaceutical movement, which I can go into more detail after, but there's a fascinating sort of evolution of this learning environment where it says, how can we apply this kind of open learning to actually solving challenges? And there's a whole movement in India and across the world trying to use sort of open learning and open research to try and develop cures for neglected diseases like tuberculosis that don't have a cure, and try and apply this type of open learning or open sort of knowledge model to developing new cures for neglected diseases. So Will and I were actually just in Paris at a conference with this open pharma movement a week or two ago to try and continue following that story. So in that sense, the journey continues both from the content from this film, but trying to continue exploring some of these themes in other projects. So,
Alfred?
I would say that it started with 3 guys. There have been no money involved between us in making this film, and today Daniel is now living in Copenhagen, and we do many things together. And the whole connection of this film was actually to the internet. So that is quite an interesting, concrete collaboration that came out of it.
Good. We take a reflection from the audience. Please.
Hello, my name is Mishra. I actually grew up in India, so it was fascinating to see this. Very soon we are going to have election, a very big, interesting democratic experiment, one of its only kind. 900 million people going to vote, and Fareed Zakaria says that fantastic in your film. You quote him, or he quotes, saying that you know the highest number of internet users per country now, India, and many other such fascinating facts. Probably, I think the largest number of English speakers in the world will be again soon India. So what I would like is to know from you all, how do we connect the Western world to this world? I mean, I have lived here in Denmark. I very seldom see a news on India. Even if 44 soldiers are dead, they don't find it worth mentioning in the news. And you know, how do you get people to be engaged in India? I mean, you showed very nicely 200 grannies getting involved, but how would, I think it's fascinating to see how these girls are so motivated, and the theory that people will learn if they really want to. But how do we connect the Western world, more so European countries, to this new great democratic experiment where all educational experiments are going on, along especially the one that you have filmed and documented. So if you have any ideas, I would love to listen. Thank you.
I guess I would just add one note that's kind of directly related to the project that we looked at. This actually was one of 7 labs that was part of the original TED experiment. And I think 3 or 4 of those labs were in the UK. So a part of what Sugata Mitra wanted to explore was how universal this idea was, and how it could be applied regardless of geography, social, economic context. And he showed an amazing success. I mean, it's formed a community where the grannies and the children that are experimenting with this in the UK can interact with those in India, and it really has kind of formed a community. And the SOUL model, the self-organized learning model, is open in its kind of methodology and approach. Anybody can tap into it, and since opening it up, apart from the 7 labs that were funded as part of the TED experiment, there have been several self-organized learning environment labs set up by people who were interested in in understanding how it could be applied to their own context throughout the world, just by passionate and motivated educators. So yeah, that's kind of a very concrete way that to answer your question.
Anna?
Yeah, the big question about motivation, I think that is what you address so strongly. That the internet is not just a structure that can harm the world, but that believing in children and believing in change and filling it up with, I think that it's also a film about values and communities. And without that, the internet can go in any other direction. So the big question is really motivation and good teachers, and teachers believing in children. And that's what's happening to education these days when it becomes too systematized, that you don't believe in the children and they have to learn specific closed, to answer closed questions. And really, I think that's, I'm not going too deeply into the theories about learning, but motivation and believing in children, they will go for that and not just for stupid plays or whatever we think children might do because we don't believe in them. So that's what I really admire in the film.
And just sort of to come back to your question about kind of connecting the world to India, I think it's about creating sort of learning cultures in this sort of ethos and this notion of community, right? Is that the school in the cloud community and the self-organized learning environment community has fostered a collection of hundreds of these grannies around the world, all of whom can sort of beam directly into classrooms in India or any other part of the world. And as a result of Seoul and some of its continued developments, there's actually 50 new labs being built in another state in India, supported by the government of that state. And in each one of those classrooms, young people sort of in India will be able to connect with the rest of the world and vice versa. And also in the sort of open source pharma project that I mentioned, it's similarly built upon this idea of community. You know, how can you build a global community of people all interested in an issue, be it education, be it pharmaceuticals, and I think, or medicine, any of those issues. And I think if you can use sort of the combination of community and sort of thematic issues that draw people together, and then create learning environments like this, be it in classrooms or sort of village rooftops in India or in any other corner of the world, you can foster that connectivity to engage people, to encourage both in their own backyard and around the world. But if you have that sense of community and that sense of sort of thematic focus, I think that's really key to connecting the world to India and India to the world and any other two corners of the world that might want to connect. So, yeah.
Alfred?
One comment is that maybe the big question we could ask is also is that just a naive dream, and how to support that, or is it just going to be 1 billion new Facebook users, you know? And that is also where we're standing right now in a historical sense, that, you know, what will happen when 1 billion new users are entering the internet? Would that affect the internet, or will it just support the current structure?
Good. We have another reaction from the audience, which I'm pleased to take.
Everyone, just wanted to say thank you for telling these stories. It's really powerful, and I think from all of us, I mean, we're all better off for having gotten to learn a bit more about Deepa and Jaya and their experience in School in the Cloud. I am curious about, so the documentary itself does look at Deepa and Jaya as outliers in the School in the Cloud experiment. By Ritu, by Sugata Mitra, I think by virtue of you all telling their specific stories, I'm curious about how, from your own experiences in observing School in the Cloud, said in 3 years or in 1 year in a group of 50 students, having one Jaya kind of makes it worth it. And I agree, and I'm curious about, and I loved getting to see the on-the-ground footage of the rest of the students in there and the way that they're kind of engaging in the curriculum. But what the program looks like for students who aren't as motivated and have this kind of really intrinsic desire to learn. And then a second part to that is I'm curious, in what ways is School in the Cloud, Sugata Mitra, working to kind of engage with parents in the community to kind of bridge the gap of the cultural divide between these students who are so motivated to learn and then parents who might have a different vision for what their daughters will do.
So in terms of I'll kind of work backwards. In terms of the engagement, I mean, it raises an interesting question in terms of the project. I think that in response to your first question, a big part of the project, right, is you can kind of hear Ritu says at the end, it's not just about the internet, but the pedagogy around it. And a big part of that pedagogy is having both somebody in the classroom and also online that can play that role of encouragement, right? And just like a grandmother, hopefully a good grandmother, would not just, focus on one of their children, they would kind of keep an eye out to make sure that everybody's included. And so I think a big part of the role of having a facilitator and having a granny there is to make sure that everybody is being looked out for and being encouraged, even if you're sort of the quieter student in the back of class. And you can see in very minor ways how Ritu does that to make sure kind of everybody feels engaged. But I think that's kind of the key part, is having that facilitation, right? And again, you're not a teacher, you're there to look out for everyone and keep them plugged in. In terms of the engagement with the community, that's sort of a really interesting question, right? Ritu was doing a bit to try and understand the perspectives of the family, but we had the good fortune of our documentary kind of going along with Ritu, and it was a really unique opportunity for Ritu to kind of plug in and get a deeper sense of the parents in the community. Because I think zooming out from the School in the Cloud, it's sort of, she raises these questions of research, right? And the project was built as a research experiment. And so oftentimes it's not, you know, in formal sense, it's the responsibility of the researcher to sort of always do that sort of connecting. But I think that that's the question that Ritu raises, right? Is that this is more than an experiment. It's really sort of important that we do more to connect and understand those perspectives.
Yeah, and just one quick point to your first question. I think the way that it's set up, in that groups of children are working together around each computer, as opposed to each child having their own computer, is a way to develop soft skills that will build confidence in kids that are maybe not the bright shining stars initially. But I think setting it up, again, looking at the way that we are shaping learning environments and the way that School in the Cloud has done it, the group environment, helping peers, and developing soft skills that encourage you to include your peers and work together is another way that I think we saw throughout the course of filming. There were new Deepas and Jayas starting to bud who had gained confidence, and I think as soon as you kind of gain confidence, the learning just kind of takes off from there exponentially. So
I think I want to bring Hannah in here as well. I think one of the major topics that are on the mind of many citizens these years, and also that has been dominating in the program of this documentary film festival, is kind of the dark side of the internet. It's misinformation, it's polarization, it's communities falling apart, it's tribalism. What you're showing in this movie, and I think what we can try to learn from also in a more general context and moving ahead from here, is that the internet and being connected to other people is also very much an option and a possibility to create something new and to empower people. So Hanny, from your perspective as the Vice Chancellor of a university, what can we learn from this type of digital cultures that are emerging? Is this something we should be looking more into also in this part of the world? I mean, we're already doing it obviously on social media, but it seems that we are getting into more conflict with each other rather than actually using these tools as learning.
Yes, you're very right, and we are more afraid perhaps. I think the very strong thing about this film is also the positive approach to something that could be very negative. The story could have been told. I'm happy to hear that they're doing so well, but it could be told in many other ways. I think one thing I want to say before talking about the internet is also this learning approach. It's collaborative, and they're not being graded individually. Because you believing in children, believing that we are motivated, that we want to learn, what the girls tell themselves, the way you approach the world, being part of a family and wanting to learn about the world. It's something that we are born with, but we don't believe in it. We feel that we have to control it, we have to contribute to it, but here we see it grow. And we see it grow because they don't have to worry about being graded separately and being better than the others. It's a true collective. Coming back to the internet, that would be also using it for such purposes, being open science, open learning environments, and not trying to hide, knowing about the communities at different levels, learning communities, and also again the competition is of course between students, between researchers, between universities. It makes it difficult to work the way you can, transcending the frontiers of countries or institutions or people, working on real world problems, because that's what we need to do, and that's what you're talking about. Real world problems that could be climate, that could be biology in different approaches. It could also be Latin. I've seen that in English schools. Because Latin was more or less lost in English schools, so they had to recreate it, and they had to do it by internet and by technological forces. And teachers who didn't know Latin would have to help and engage in the learning. So it can be many, many ways you can do it, if only you stop thinking in the negative way and start introducing the positive forces. Of course, not in a naive way, but that's another thing.
So Daniel, have we forgotten about the empowering role of technology in human life the last couple of years and months? Should we revisit that hypothesis that these technologies can really empower communities and give them a whole new voice?
I mean, I think it comes down to what you were mentioning, that it's about sort of the learning culture that you create, right? The collaborative space that you create. And I think that if you can create that you can sort of introduce any type of technology, right? And that it will be fruitful in its results. And I think that what happens is, because the environment here and in some of the other projects that we saw across India, because they're built with this sort of collaborative ethos, this community-driven approach, that the internet becomes this amazing amplifier that has no, alternative. It's just this amazing resource and tool, and you could see in the sort of the beautiful simplicity of the way Deepa sort of, it's a world tour. She sort of captures the magic of what's there. And I think that if you have the right environment to facilitate that sort of openness and tap into that motivation that exists in most of us, right? That the internet becomes quite a wonderland in some sense, right? If you have that ethos behind it. And I think just as another sort of interesting point, that in our travels across India, there was one gentleman who's one of the leading scholars on internet issues in India, the Center for Internet Society in Bangalore. And we asked him to describe what was so powerful about the internet, and he basically described it, in similar terms to how Deepa does. It's just this, he used words like magic, he used words that had sort of a fantasy and a bit of imagination to them, and it was quite profound, right? That even the foremost scholar in India, when you kind of really drilled right down to what the potential and the possibility was, that he described it with the same youthful energy that Deepa is. So I think it really speaks to the fact that if we can create the right learning environments and culture around it, that there's sort of a simple or a subtle magic to what these technologies can be if we understand and build sort of environments to use them the right way.
Well, Alfred?
Yeah, I also think today it's very easy to be very critical, but again, to remind ourselves that the essence of this, the essence of technology is humans. And this is kind of giving us a glimpse into what it could be. I think that is something that I have to remind myself every day, that there is still actually the opportunities of using it in a different way.
Just one really quick point. I do think that the question of, especially in the context of an experiment like School in the Cloud, the question around the concerns with misinformation in the internet age is an important one to be critical of and to think about how it applies to an experiment like this. So I think kind of the next step, and I don't think we saw this explicitly being addressed by School in the Cloud, but how to ensure that students are using a diversity of platforms and resources to find answers, and also understand how information can be promoted by certain groups in order to promote their own agendas, and to understand how to kind of navigate through this current world of misinformation, where it can be challenging to find what is true and what is not.
We'll take another reflection from the audience.
Thank you for a thought-provoking but also very emotional film. Many interesting ideas there. There is one regarding the possibilities and the opportunities that are open with these sort of approaches, which is the connection with the future of work, right? So we are still debating a lot how the future of work will look like, but we are educating like we did in the past. So one thing that was shown in the documentary is this idea of really engaging through questions that do not have answers yet. And the future of work is one of such big questions. So I wonder if you have thoughts, or during the documentary this thing emerged about this deep uncertainty of the future of work and how we leverage these sort of approaches to really answer that unanswered question.
So I think my first response would be to refer back to this other project that we've been exploring, where regardless of the theme of open source pharmaceutical, the core ethos of the way that the project is taking shape is actually building upon this approach to learning, but applying it to possibilities for work, where actually there's communities of people that one researcher named Jalil has developed, and he's sort of convening people on his rooftop in a village in the south of India to have people from all different backgrounds. Some of them are stay-at-home moms, some of them are retired school teachers, some of them are retired police officers, farmers, people that otherwise would sort of be unengaged in collective efforts and ideas, and they all convene to help research ways of developing cures for tuberculosis, sitting on a rooftop in a village in the south of India. And so I think in terms of ways of work, right, while there's still questions and challenges around how the economics and the logistics of all these things might work, I think that you can sort of show that it's possible to work this way, right? To not just learn this way, but if we can build sort of the right structures and the right decentralized economics around how to actually support this way of learning, that, you know, the student's capacity to answer a question like, why do we need a constitution, could also be a question of how do we engage communities in XYZ problem, and they're actually working to solve challenges in their own communities, you know? And so I think that for me, it's really just extrapolating some of the examples we see here and the ways that people can learn, and thinking about how can we build economics around that way of working to actually support livelihoods in solving challenges that way. That'd just be the most concrete sort of example I can think of, though. But I think there's lots of possibilities. And I'd be curious to see what the girls would say if you asked them that big question in a classroom about the future of work.
So I guess one of the major drivers for solving some of the key challenges you mentioned, Daniel, is collaboration. And I know that this film has also been produced and created in a very collaborative environment. You have had universities involved, you have had researchers, you have had other documentary filmmakers, you have had a research foundation, a private charity. How did you manage to get a product like this out of such a complex collaborative enterprise?
I think the first word is, there's two words, right, to keep it super simple, is honesty and trust, right? That from the outset, there was complete transparency. We said, Alfred, what you're learning is fascinating, can we help? Oh yeah, here's what we can do. Okay, that's what we can do, how can we do it? And it was just, I mean, obviously there's lots of very challenging logistical elements to it, but from the very outset, you know, I think being really honest about what we were interested in exploring and trusting each other to find a way kind of was the fuel that allowed it to happen. And then obviously there's lots of logistical pieces which are not as exciting or interesting, but.
It's also interesting to see that there's not a lot of incentive structure that support this kind of, you could say, productions. So even if I want to have it back to the university, I have to write a paper about it, because in this form it's not giving any impact in a traditional kind of currency. And I think that the same goes for you guys. So when we have to do something new, it's like, then we have to believe in what we're doing for a little while, and then maybe it'll give us something back in a different way. And definitely here is very much to explore this question in a different way.
Helen?
Yeah, we probably we have to also in the academic world to find new ways of understanding knowledge and transmitting knowledge, because we have to write articles that only few people will read. I'm sure we will continue doing that, but we also have to be able to understand research and knowledge in completely new ways, in more collaborative way, more transcending ways, and more open ways. And I would add to your openness and trust and courage, I would also add critical thinking and a very good judgment, which also comes from methods. Methods we live by in science, but that we come to live by, so that we can do things with them and not just show that we are following the methods.
And it's also the question about how do we engage the next generation. I did a lecture, I'm not often doing that, but at Roskilde, and the first thing you meet is 150 Mac screens, and it's really difficult to start from there, and then you feel that this generation is not using the internet, they're more addicted to it than using it as a tool for something bigger than the internet itself.
And I would just add that it was not easy. The process of collaborating around this film, including building trust and kind of understanding how to work with our own internal team as well as other collaborators that we brought on, was a learning process for ourselves in collaboration and what collaboration means and what is the appropriate level of structure, how to build relationships that are honest, how to work without traditional incentive structures to make a product that everybody is proud of and gets credit for in an equal way. So yeah, it was difficult.
And I think just to kind of tie everything up, it's important to all these words that we mentioned and also the ideas in the film. It's kind of about applying your own ethos to the way you work, right? It's kind of trying to be critical of our own process, trying to apply all these keywords to the way that we worked, and also using the internet in a collaborative way. At times we were living in 4 or 5 different countries amongst the teams and sending edits back and forth and saying, wow, we can do this because of the tools we have. And so I think it's about really using the process as also a reflection of what you're trying to articulate. And the last thing I would offer, just in terms of, we're sitting here at a documentary film festival, and this idea of knowledge and research, I think that the power of documentary film is it allows Deepa's voice to be put on the same level as Sugata Mitra's, right, who's sitting on a stage at the TED, at the TED event giving a big speech, but you realize that both of them have a deep knowledge, right, and it allows it to be recognized as being different forms of knowledge, right? Not better or worse, but in order to really understand the world, documentary, I think, can provide a powerful opportunity to show that knowledge takes many forms, and they can actually speak to each other if we allow ourselves to strip away some of the institutional boundaries and some of the incentives that sometimes corrupt our perspectives on what knowledge is important and when.
Well done, gentlemen. Congratulations on the film, and we are all been pleased to have you here this afternoon. Let's give them an applause.
Thank you.